The recently rediscovered Gospel of Judas tells a story that is in opposition to what is found in the four Gospels of the New Testament. It presents Judas the hero instead of Judas the traitor. It proclaims a plethora of gods instead of one true God. Jesus is portrayed as a mystic seeking deliverance from his physical body instead of the Son of God who willingly dies for the redemption of humankind. There is no question, the Gospel of Judas is a different gospel. But how do we know which one is correct?
Another issue here that you could ask, another way of testing this in terms of preference here, is just simply to read them. Instead of just worrying about the Gospel of Judas, read it and compare it to the canonical Gospels. You'll find, ask the question, the reader asks the question, which one is food for the soul?
The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written in the first century. The Judas Gospel was written about 100 years after the canonical Gospels. This means the Gospels of the New Testament are closer to the original events surrounding the life of Christ. The Gospel of Judas is much later. The Church Fathers from the early 2nd century onward all believed that the four Gospels were written by those whose names they bear. This means Matthew and John are eyewitness accounts. The Gospels of Mark and Luke are equally compelling in that they are closely associated with New Testament apostles, as Luke was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, and Mark was a companion of St. Peter.
Well, our acceptance of the New Testament is really a matter of faith. So we accept those Gospels and the other documents of the New Testament because they are presented to us by the Christian Church as the true revelation of Jesus. And through the mediation of the Church, we put faith in Jesus as revealed in them.
Even though the official canon of the New Testament was not finally settled until the Council of Carthage in 397 AD, the four Gospels, as well as the other books of the New Testament, were recognized as Scripture long before that time. By the end of the first century, the four Gospels were cited as authoritative.
Bruce Metzger, a former professor at Princeton, came out with a book a while back, The Canon of the New Testament. And he makes a wonderful statement. Later on in the book, he talks about this. It's remarkable that while there's some, confusion on a clear demarcation of the canon until several centuries into the early church, yet we see a strong and a very large acceptance of the canon very early on.
A first-century letter called the Epistle of Pseudo-Barnabas quotes several times from the book of Matthew, as does the Didache, also known as the Teaching of the 12, written either at the end of the first century or the beginning of the 2nd century. The same is true of the other Gospels as well. All four are quoted as authoritative accounts of the life of Christ by various Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The same cannot be said of the Gospel of Judas.
Why this great fascination with this and other Gospels, especially those from the Gnostic groups? I think it's good to remind ourselves that the discovery of many different Gospels is really not such a great surprise. Indeed, Luke begins his New Testament Gospel by telling us that the reason he composed his work was due precisely to the fact that there were already, in this early time in the history of the Church, many accounts of the life of Christ that were being circulated. So Luke took on the role of an investigative journalist to document that which could be verified about the life of Christ.
One of the oldest lists of canonical books is the Muratorian Canon, which most scholars believe was compiled sometime before 170 AD. Because the first part of the list has decayed over the passage of time, there is no mention of Matthew or Mark. Nonetheless, it is clear that its author believed all four Gospels were Scripture.
The third book of the Gospel is that according to Luke, the well-known physician. The fourth of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples. The Muratorian Canon